Welcome to another broadcast of the Deborah Ruffini Show on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are archived. You can find them at artistfirst.com. And now, from England, here she is, your host, Deborah Ruffini.
Greetings from England. This is Deborah Ruffini with another broadcast of the Deborah Ruffini Show. Today it is my absolute pleasure to be speaking again with the amazing Nancy Little, discussing further the horrendous things which she had to suffer during her childhood. Things which no child should have to go through, but especially taking a look at Munchausen. Have I pronounced that right, Nancy? Munchausen by proxy?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. So Nancy, very pleased to have you with us again. Thank you so much. You're always a pleasure to talk to, and you always give a great...
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Oh, the pleasure's all ours. So, so this is interesting. I think I'd heard the term, but I don't know too much about this. So, what exactly is this? It's where some. Sorry, yes, no, carry on. Yeah,
Munchausen syndrome is when a person presents himself to others, usually a specific medical personnel, such as a nurse or doctor, when in reality they're really not. Or they've taken a disease and they've enlarged it, made it bigger than it is, made it more difficult. Munchausen by proxy is when a caregiver, typically a parent, and a victim, which is usually their child, and they create either a disease for the child or perhaps, as in my case, I had JRA, which is short for juvenile rheumatoid arthritis.
Right.
And they will take that disease and make it worse than it really is.
Okay.
And so sometimes they will go to doctors and they'll want special tests, they'll want more invasive tests than the child really needs, or they're very vague on what the problem really is. Instead of answering the doctor, they may move a lot like we did. They may come up with a lot of missing parts as far as when the doctor wants to do a medical history. I lost the records. Oh, I'm not sure where exactly we went to or which hospital. Oh. And so it makes it very hard for medical personnel to be able to document a correct diagnosis and or find out what the child really needed versus what the mother says the child needs. In the past, this has been labeled as factitious disorder.
Okay.
But in recent years, they have started referring it to Munchausen by proxy. And Munchausen by proxy is considered a severe form of child abuse, which usually requires immediate intervention from medical personnel and Child Protective Services, which is the agency that handles child abuse in the U.S. So that would be whatever agency handles it where you're at. Here we call it for short CPS, for Child Protective Services.
Yeah.
And often what we see is not only a child is being abused by a parent in this manner, but there's often child sexual abuse, physical abuse, and emotional abuse, which is all intertwined. So typically it's just not Munchausen by proxy, and it's not just a medical thing, but the parent also incorporates emotional abuse, physical abuse, and it's why it's so important for this to be diagnosed. The caregiver may also have a psychiatric disorder like bipolar, anxiety, depression, that has often gone untreated for years.
Right.
Diagnosing it is challenging for doctors because of the dishonesty by the parent.
Yeah.
One core principle in diagnosing Munchausen by proxy is that deception is present in all cases. And again, that's either by making the disease the child has worse, or just dreaming up diseases
Completely
that they think the child has. And there's been cases where children have had multiple unnecessary surgeries because the parent insists that something's wrong.
Yeah.
Some of the main criteria that they look for to be met in diagnosing it is the parent engages in the deceptive falsification of physical or psychological signs or symptoms, or the induction of an injury or disease. That the person presents the victim to others as ill, injured, or impaired. And in my case, I was diagnosed with JRA at the age of 5 or 6. I was in first grade.
Yeah.
I had the signs since I was 3 years old, but my parents hadn't taken me to find out what was wrong. At the time, in 1964, the school I was going to in Oklahoma was afraid I was going to be hurt on the playground if they didn't find out what was wrong with me. I was severely underweight. I probably weighed maybe 25 or 30 pounds at the age of 6.
Right.
My knees were so swollen that I couldn't even touch my feet together.
Right. Oh, dear.
My hands and my wrists were very tiny. In fact, my wrists are still so small now that if I wore a watch, I would have to wear a child's watch. That's how small they are.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
At the time when I was 9 or 10, I used to have knots, large, looked like egg knots on my wrist that was full with fluid, but my parents never did anything about it. They never allowed me to have medical treatment for the JRA. Today, if my mother was still doing the things that, like if I was a child today and she was doing this, I think she would clearly be diagnosed with Munchausen by proxy.
Yeah.
She clearly used my diagnosis to receive sympathy from other people. She used it to keep me isolated from other children. I wasn't allowed to go to activities at school or church. She used it to explain to other people I was too ill. That's why I couldn't go to activities at church or the school activities. And as a child, it was really embarrassing for her to talk about me as if I didn't even exist.
Yeah,
she would talk about me at church with her friends while I'm standing there as though I didn't exist, talking about how difficult it was for me to walk. And I mean, there was a time that when I was 5 or 6 that I couldn't walk. I crawled backwards everywhere I needed to go.
Oh my goodness. Was all that...
But in all of that, she still did not take me to the doctor to find out what was going on.
Was part of that to keep you as her property, almost?
Yes, a parent who has Munchausen by proxy is very enmeshed with their child. It's like they cannot separate that child as a separate person from them.
Right.
And so to enable me to be my own person and to get me that medical help that I needed, I might get better, and I wouldn't need her.
Oh.
That's what she would say. You need me.
Yeah.
So if I got better, then she couldn't handle it because she needed me to need her, to put it in her words.
Yeah.
She came up with a whole slew of vitamins, supplements, iron tonic, all kinds of different things that she poured down me that, of course, had not been suggested by any doctors. At one point, she had me taking 15 calcium tablets a day.
Oh, dear.
And I do believe that that's partly why I've had so many issues with my bones, because you can overtake something just as you can undertake something.
Yeah.
And she wasn't, we have parents who have Munchausen by proxy can go either way. They can either, take the child to the doctor constantly and come up with all these diseases, but you can also go the other way of not taking the child to the doctor, but believing that you know better than the doctor, so why go to a doctor? Because I can treat you.
Yeah.
And that's what my mother did, was she decided that she could treat all of this, and she knew better than the medical professionals. So she was, I've talked before about the sexual abuse from her, and this was part of it. She would force laxatives down me every few days so that she could do the colonics and the enemas with the sexual abuse.
Yeah.
So this is again where all of this, the physical abuse, the emotional abuse, the sexual abuse is all intertwined with the Munchausen by proxy. And very seldom do you have just Munchausen without the emotional abuse, the physical abuse, and the sexual abuse. It's all intertwined with each other.
Oh, is it really? That's usually all together, yeah? Yeah.
Along with the vitamins, the supplements, the iron tonics, she decided that the doctors didn't know how to make me gain weight, so she was going to figure out how to make me gain weight, and she started feeding me, the powders you can buy on the internet now, or TV, that's supposed to make you gain weight.
Yeah.
So she started putting all that in my food and my drinks and milkshakes and stuff like that. None of that made me gain weight. None of that cured my RA.
No.
She spent thousands of dollars in all these supplements and vitamins and powders that they could have used to get me the proper medical help that I truly need.
Yeah.
Often, a parent who has Munchausen by proxy is a single parent, but not always. And in my case, my dad and mom were married.
Yeah.
But my dad was gone most of the time. And so my care was primarily left up to my mother. And so he generally was not around when she was doing these things. There were times that she would wrap my knees up so tight with bandages that literally I could not walk. And so she decided that she had to carry me everywhere.
Oh, my goodness.
Even though I could walk. And then she would take them off so I could go to school the next day. And then we'd go through the same thing when I would get home. She would decide that I couldn't walk that night. And sometimes a lot of these, and I use the word treatments because that's what she would call them, but that's not what they were. No. But she would use the treatments in order to either sexually abuse me or it was a punishment for something she thought I did wrong. So that's where the emotional abuse is all intertwined in all of this. And it took me a long time to figure out as an adult what this really was, because nobody talked about this.
No.
Even in 1978 when I started college, in my psychology and social work classes, this was not something anybody talked about then. This is now just beginning to become more apparent, and doctors are finally starting to realize that just because you've got a parent who's there wringing their hands and is really upset doesn't mean that everything is okay in that home.
No.
And one of the signs that doctors are seeing is that typically it's the mother. They have the mother who is completely distraught, like more distraught than what the case typically would be, and they can't leave the child even for 3 minutes to go fill out paperwork. I mean, they're just hovering over the child. They won't let the child answer, and that's some of the things that my mother did for me. Like if we were at church and she was talking to one of her friends and I would try to say something, she would grab my arm and pinch underneath my wrist where people couldn't see, and that was her way of telling me to shut up, that I wasn't allowed to speak. And so this is something they see a lot, where the parent constantly answers the questions, even though they've asked the child the question, the parent won't let the child answer. So these are some of the things that we're seeing in this syndrome.
It's terribly, everything about this is control, isn't it? Control and utter selfishness.
Very much. Control is like the number one big thing that you can take away from it.
Yeah.
When I was the one thing that my mother did was, even though typically we didn't go to, like, medical doctors, she would take me to a chiropractor. Oh. And as you know, when I was very young, the female chiropractor was one of the ladies that sexually abused me along with my mother.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
But when we moved around and we moved out of the area where this Dr. Smalley was, she took me back to a chiropractor, a male chiropractor, when I was about 10. My mother was convinced that I had curvature of the spine, where your spine is kind of like an S instead of straight.
All right.
And she was just hell-bent on, this is something that Nancy has, and the doctor did the x-rays, and he's like, you know, Mrs. Yater, I don't see that. Her spine is a healthy, straight, normal 10-year-old spine.
Yeah.
And my mother got extremely irate, was screaming at him in the office. I know that she has curvature of the spine. I know she's going to die from this. You're not looking at it right. You need to take more x-rays. I mean, she just went ballistic. And this is a typical reaction of a parent who has already decided that their child has something and will not listen to sound medical advice.
Yeah.
When I was about 11 or so, she had also decided that I had something wrong with my private parts.
Right.
And she again took me to another doctor who told her, Mrs. Yater, everything is fine with Nancy. There's nothing wrong.
Yeah.
And once again, we saw the same reaction. She was convinced that this was something I had. She couldn't understand why the doctor was just not listening to her, and she just went ballistic, screaming and yelling and red in the face. Never went back to the doctor, and here I am, 63 years old, perfectly healthy down there.
Yeah.
But
so, was a lot of that, was it, or was any part of that, if you were from a Christian home, your parents were devout Christians, as indeed you are.
Yes.
Was it anything to do with God told me and I know better than the medical profession that may not be saved? Anything like that?
Well, my parents, both of them, we belonged to a denomination at the time that pretty much believed that the only way to get better was laying on hands for healing.
Right. Yeah.
And so, for the longest time, part of that, a good part of that, was from this doctrine.
Oh.
The other half of that was that we moved a lot, constantly actually, anywhere from 1 to 3 times a year.
Whew, that's often.
And so it made it really hard to establish health care anywhere. But the other half of that is that for my mother, at least, if we had gone to like a regular medical doctor, somebody might have figured out what was going on.
Oh, yeah.
And so that was a big part of, I believe, why we didn't go to doctors, why we didn't, we were taught from a very young age by both of my parents, what happens at home stays at home.
That's convenient, isn't it? Yeah.
To not talk to anybody about what happens at home. About anything. When I was 15 or 16, my dad had lost his job again, and he had moved to Oklahoma City. We lived in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and he was trying to find work, and we literally had, no food in the house.
Right.
And one of the things that my parents had drilled into us, as being from a Christian home, is don't lie, tell the truth.
Yeah.
And somebody asked me at church, did we have, with your dad out of work, did you have enough food in the house to eat? And I didn't think too much about it at the time. I just said no. We didn't have milk, food, meat, eggs, the basics right now because Dad hadn't sent money. And I got in serious trouble for answering honestly.
Oh.
Just yelled and screamed at and pinned against the wall. And I told you don't talk about what happens at home. This stays at home. You should have never been honest. And so when you grow up in that, it makes a child fearful.
Yeah.
You don't know how to answer a question. I talked about this on one of the radio shows when I was 6 on the playground, and this is probably what precipitated the school demanding that they take me to find out what was wrong with me medically, is some boys' heads were throwing rocks at me and split my head open with the rocks.
Oh, yeah.
And my forehead was bleeding, and it was continued to bleed. Every day I would get there, and my hair would be stuck in the blood on my forehead. And the teacher would use some warm water and get it unstuck. And she asked me for a good week, Nancy, why didn't your mom or dad take you to get stitches and stitch your forehead up? Because I had this huge gash still.
Ooh.
And I remember looking at my feet with tears rolling down my face.
Yeah.
And I couldn't answer her because I knew if I told her that we weren't allowed to go to doctors, that I would be in serious trouble. And that should have been a huge sign to the teacher that something's wrong.
Yeah.
When a child can't look at you in the eye and they have tears rolling down their face.
Yeah.
And yet nothing was done. Back in the early 60s when I grew up, they just assumed that parents knew best.
Yeah.
And if that's the way they want to live, then that's the way they want to live. And today, a teacher is required, when something like that would happen, to call CPS.
Yeah.
And have an investigation made to find out why is this child not getting proper medical care. But we didn't have that then.
No.
In fact, I was 10 years old before they even created CPS in the United States.
Oh, that's unfortunate, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, and don't get involved.
And even though they created it then, they certainly didn't know anything about mothers that abuse kids, because in the mid-60s, when I would have been 10 years old, they wouldn't have, they had the idea that all mothers are loving.
Yeah, yeah.
And that the only people that really abuse children are angry alcoholic fathers.
Yeah, yeah, it was a stigma.
And that was the thought process back then. Of course, we know today that that's not true, but we still have a lot of people who do not understand that mothers can abuse their children physically, sexually, emotionally, just as often and maybe worse than a man can.
Yeah.
But we still have that taboo, and that's one reason that I continue to speak out, and you're gracious enough to allow me to have a place to do that so that we can make awareness. And every time, you download a show that you and I do, I hear from other women who tell me, my grandmother did this, my mother did this, my aunt did this, and I didn't know anyone else had gone through this. Thank you so much for talking about it. And it breaks my heart that even in 2023, we still have people who are afraid to tell anyone that this happened to them because they're going to be ostracized by other family members. And I hear that constantly. Well, I tried to tell my dad, and he told me that, you must have misunderstood, and that's what my dad used to tell me. You must have understood her intentions.
Oh.
No, I really didn't.
Yeah.
And so when you tell a child or a young adult, when they try to speak out about it, that you've misunderstood it all, again, you're being told that, one, this didn't happen, and that, two, you must be stupid because you couldn't figure out that this really wasn't abuse when it was.
Yeah.
So when you're told that this really didn't happen enough, you start to doubt yourself and think you're the one who's crazy.
Yeah. Absolutely. Can I just say at this point, Nan, so the pleasure's all mine, and because as you know, I'm hopping mad about any kind of abuse, but especially abuse where we don't expect it, and abuse that's carried out by people that should represent a loving Heavenly Father they're supposed to stand by. I mean, even if the person's atheist, it doesn't matter the belief system, but it's all horrific. And the thing that's maybe just to mention this briefly, if that's okay, not to divert, but I feel even more passionate about this now because I've had I was going to use a word I probably couldn't use on air. I've had that's how angry I am. I've had a telling off from the police for, having not guests on air, but speaking out about the abuser, because apparently it's not fair on the abuser.
Right.
But it's okay to abuse, but it's not fair on the abuser to speak about it, and that makes me really angry. So yes, we'll have you on more. We'll speak about this because this is right. This is the right thing to do. It is the right thing to. Otherwise, you're just back to square one, being further abused, sort of from beyond the grave, if you like. If you don't have a platform.
Right.
It's so important.
And I think it's just imperative that we do get these stories out so that other people can hear that this happens.
Yeah.
Absolutely. My mother, with the whole Munchausen by proxy, there wasn't even a diagnosis of that back in the 60s that I know of, and if it was, no one ever talked about it. It's only been in the last, say, 8 to 10 years that people are starting to be aware of it.
Yeah. And
doctors are starting, and nurses are starting to identify it more and more, but even with, parents that move like my parents do, that makes it easier for a parent who has this to continue it, because you can't trace, it makes it very hard to trace records.
Yeah.
And we've seen cases where we had hurricanes and massive tornadoes, for example, in the United States, and records got lost. Yeah. And so parents that have Munchausen just made it up for the doctor. And they had no way to trace it. So they just accepted that what mother said was fact. And that can perpetrate and make it worse for the child because they have no way to discount it.
Yeah.
Now with computer records, I think I'm hoping at least that cases like this will be identified a little more quickly.
Yeah.
Versus the whole handwriting, on paper like it used to be in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I'm hoping that will make it a little harder, but then again, or easier, but if you have a parent like my parent who don't take your child to the doctor at all, who's going to speak up for that child?
Yeah, exactly.
Because my parents didn't take me to the doctor. At one point when we first moved to Texas, when I was almost 9 and in 3rd grade, in the United States anyway, a child is supposed to have a certain amount of immunizations before they begin school. My sister and I had none at all.
Oh.
And I was almost 9, my sister was 15. And yet we hadn't had any immunizations. And so we both had to stay out of school before we were able to start so that we could catch up on the shots that we were supposed to have years ago.
Yeah.
And during this, they discovered I was very anemic. And, of course, that's a side effect of the arthritis for sure.
Yeah.
And so for a while, I was taken to a doctor once a week for blood draws to check my levels and to check on the anemia.
Right.
And the doctor there wanted to treat the JRA. And my parents literally had a knockdown, drag-out fight in the middle of the doctor's office with my dad trying to make me leave and my mother trying to make me stay, and they're both pulling on each arm.
Yeah.
And people are sitting here watching this, and nobody said a word.
Oh, really?
Nurse didn't intervene. The other people didn't intervene. They're screaming and hollering at each other. And both of them are pulling on me, and I'm crying and bawling, and stop, please, just stop.
Yeah.
And everybody just sat there like nothing was happening. And so when you go through that as a child, you start to realize that no one is going to intervene on your behalf.
Yeah.
And if a doctor or somebody in the medical profession isn't going to stop that, then who's going to listen to you?
Yeah, that's quite true. Yeah.
And, some of the things that she did, just didn't make sense. There was no logic. And I guess that's why now I'm kind of a logical person. I want them to make sense.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what makes this disease so difficult for the child who's going through it, because nothing makes sense. Everything is either blown out of proportion, like her, explaining that, or telling me I couldn't walk, knowing full well that I could walk.
Yeah.
She decided one day, and she did this up until the time I left home, was she decided that she needed to enhance my circulatory system.
Right.
And her idea to do this was to take boiling water from a tea kettle, and I do mean to a boil, put it in a pan, and put ice water with ice cubes in another pan.
Right.
And she would put my feet in the ice cubes for like 3 minutes, and then move it over to the boiling water.
Ooh,
and do the same.
Ooh.
And I cannot tell you how excruciatingly painful that was.
Yeah. What was that about?
And my dad would be there when she did this and never said a word.
Was he...
And I would be screaming and crying and begging her to stop.
Oh.
And when you grow up with that type of treatment and no one intervening on your behalf when somebody's sitting in there and watching this, you're not going to believe that anybody in the outside world is going to help you.
Yeah, of course.
Not if your own dad isn't stopping her.
Was he frightened of her? Sorry, I might have asked you that before. Does he just not want to get involved, or was he scared of anything she may have done to him?
I think that he didn't want to enrage her against him.
Oh, crikey.
So it was just easier to let her do whatever she wanted to do, and maybe she would get it out of her system and stop, is my guess.
That's horrible, isn't it? I mean, that's horrible enough to have one parent doing that, but to have the other one just being silent and not coming to... I mean, daddies are supposed to be our heroes, to not come to your rescue of his little girl. You know, that's what fathers are supposed to do, isn't it?
It is what they're supposed to do, and I loved him to death.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, but...
Head in the sand.
I can't imagine doing that to a child and just being the other parent and watching it and not intervening, not even to the point of saying, Pearl, stop.
Yeah.
Don't do that. That's not right.
Yeah.
Nothing. Just watching your TV show or going in the other room and working on work. Sometimes he would just get up and leave the house and go have a burger somewhere and not be at the house because he didn't want to watch it.
Oh, goodness.
Which makes you feel even worse because then you're like, well, I'm not even worth him hanging around for.
Yeah. Yeah, it must have felt that way, mustn't it?
And so people will ask adult survivors, well, why didn't you tell? Well, heck, would you tell? If you're being treated like this at home and your other parent just stands by and does nothing, would you think to ask anybody else? No.
No.
If your own parent won't stop this, then why would anybody else care enough? Because the two people who are supposed to love you the most is your mom and dad.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so if they won't stop it, why would anybody else stop it?
And also, if you did tell, sort of home is where you need to be, so that it would have made it more dangerous for you.
It would have made it worse, and that's why, like, you know, when the teacher was asking me, you know, why hadn't I gone to the doctor and got my head stitched up?
Yeah.
I knew that if I had said, you know, we're not allowed to go to the doctor, then I would have been in more trouble when I got home.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's why I had learned at a young age just to look down and not look in their eyes, because there's something that breaks inside of you as a child.
Yeah. And I guess...
And so if you don't look in their eyes, at least it makes it easier in your head to keep silent.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's a part of you inside that you're thinking, please stop this, please figure this out, please stop this. But yet, there's also that side inside that thinks, don't figure this out, because if you send me back home, I know I'm dead.
Yeah.
You know, because we've seen judges that constantly send children back into abusive homes.
Yeah.
And those kids know that if they go back, then it's going to be 10 times as worse.
Yeah.
And I do believe there are parents who do want to change and do change to not abuse their kids, but there's also parents like my mother who I don't believe any amount of help would have made her stop. So sending me back into that would have been a death sentence.
Yes.
Which is why I learned to keep quiet, because my goal from the time I was maybe 10 or 11 on was to just make it till I could leave.
Yeah.
Just hold on until I can leave. And at the age of 15, 16 years old, my sister had been allowed to take driver's ed, and at the time you could take it through your school.
Right.
And I wanted to take it, and she kept putting me off, and one day she just erupted at me, and she said, if I let you take driver's ed, I know you'll leave and never come back.
Oh, okay.
So again, it was that enmeshment that kept her holding on to me.
Yeah.
And that's why, when I did leave, that I left without telling anybody and packed everything I could pack in my car. And I had an hour when I knew both of my parents were going to be gone that day.
Oh.
And I left college, left my job, went home, packed everything I could put in my car. And, of course, I couldn't pack anything beforehand. They would have figured it out.
Oui.
And so I only took what I could put in my car as fast as I could within an hour, and I left.
My goodness. Well done.
Because I knew that she was not going to let me go otherwise.
That's like being held in a prison, isn't it? I mean, that's an incredibly brave thing to do. A desperate thing, of course, naturally, but very brave.
And terrifying.
Terrifying, yes. Terrifying.
Because I was afraid, what if they figure out where I went? Because my dad knew where I worked during the day.
Oh, right.
And he had been up there more than once, ranting and raving about different things.
Mm.
And so my boss was the one who loaned me the money to get out, to move out.
Yeah. Oh,
and
bless him.
She was the one who helped me leave.
Huh. Yeah.
And
that's good.
Again, it just kind of shows the dynamic. My dad knew where I worked, but he never came once to find out why I left.
Mm. He knew, didn't he? He knew.
Yeah. He knew why I left. And again, we didn't talk about those sort of things, so out of sight, out of mind, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you know, I'm just thinking, I'm surprised your mum didn't have you homeschooled, because she would have had you all to herself. Yeah.
If I had raised now, probably she would have, but there wasn't homeschooling back when I was in school.
Oh, okay, right.
We didn't start really hearing about it to the 80s, and of course I graduated college in 82, so.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, of course.
Back when I was little, if they had it as religious as they were, they probably would have homeschooled us.
Yeah.
But there just wasn't that, and that's why when they threatened my parents with, Nancy can't come back to school unless you figure out what is causing, her disability, because obviously there was a problem. You could look at me and figure that out.
Yeah.
And it's funny because, I asked my dad when I was in my 30s, I said, Dad, how could you not know how bad this disease was when I was little?
Mm.
He took thousands of pictures of us. My dad loved his camera and was constantly taking pictures before church, after church, with other people. And he said, well, I just never realized it was that bad. And I'm like, how can you not look at these pictures?
Yeah.
I mean, you've seen the picture. I sent one to you of how swollen my knees were.
That's right, yeah.
How can you look at that and not realize that this is a problem?
Yeah.
I still don't understand that.
I think it's probably...
And I probably never will understand how he can look at those pictures and not realize that there's a problem here.
I would imagine it's probably something along the lines of if he admitted it verbally, then he would have to say sorry.
To do something about it.
Yeah, and that would require an apology and probably a breaking down of, I'm really sorry, but yeah.
And, I mean, it's sad to say, because I know divorce can be devastating for children, but my sister and I used to beg our parents when we were little to get a divorce.
Did you? Yeah, I bet.
And that was before people really talked about it much, because most of the kids in my class growing up, at least until I was a teenager anyway, had two married parents. There were very few kids of divorce.
Mm.
And so if you did have parents of divorce, you were kind of in a different category, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And we used to beg them to please just get a divorce because the fights were so bad and the violence was that bad. And we recognized even at a very young age, before we knew the words abuse, before we knew that even existed, that something wasn't right with them.
Yeah.
And that other parents didn't throw things at each other, and other parents didn't have to worry about hiding bruises when they went to church.
Yeah.
And all of that. We didn't have words to explain what was going on at home, but somehow deep inside we still knew that it wasn't right.
Yeah. Yeah. Intuition. Yeah. Yeah, it's that confusing time, isn't it, where you know something doesn't quite make sense and doesn't quite fit in, nothing's rational, but at the same time, it's the parent, it's the grown-up, there must be something right about this, even though it's desperately wrong. Yeah.
I mean, from the time when my sister went to college, left to go to college when I was 10 and a half, and in some respects, the sexual abuse escalated because we had always shared a room.
Yeah.
And so she was gone, finally, as far as being at the house all the time. And so it made the sexual abuse worse because she wasn't in the room where she had to work around when Jeannie was home. And I didn't know the words abuse. I certainly didn't know the word sexual abuse because we didn't talk about things like that in the late 60s.
Yeah.
And in fact, I didn't even hear about that until I was probably freshman in high school that I really began to realize what this was and it wasn't right.
Yeah.
And I would scream to her at 11, 12, 13 years old, "Stop this. All mothers don't do this." She broke my jaw by holding her jaw as tight as she could in her hands, and she would get all the way down nose to nose and scream at me that all mothers do this. And I just knew deep down that all mothers didn't do this.
No.
And I didn't have, I hadn't read anything yet about abuse at 10, 11 years old. But there was just something, that intuition, maybe it was God, whatever you believe it is, I just knew deep down that all mothers didn't do that. And I had nothing really to go on it other than maybe watching a few TV shows to realize that all mothers didn't do this.
Hardly any.
And then when I started babysitting and going into other people's homes, and I watched the relationships between the parents, between each other, and realized that all parents didn't throw things at each other, and all parents didn't yell and scream and hit each other.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, in high school, I started reading everything I could about abuse because I knew that was my calling, that I wanted to be a social worker and work with children who had been abused, and that was what I wanted to do. And everybody at the churches that we went to all told me that I would change my mind, that nobody knew what they wanted to do when they were 13, 14, 15 years old, but I did.
Yes, I bet. From first-hand experience, yeah, of course. And sometimes it takes something like that, an unfortunate situation ourselves, to want to help others so that they don't have to go through that, so that, to try and save others. And I think you do a brilliant job. I think it's amazing. But it's, oh, Nancy, you're such a blessing. Because that could have gone one of two ways. You could have either triumphed and thought, right, okay, I'm now going to want to protect other people, save them from going through this, or crumbled, or being an abuser yourself, because sometimes that can happen as well. And just thank God that it didn't, you didn't let this dictate to you. Yeah, ruin
hurt
you.
other people. A lot of people who go through things like this end up on drugs.
Yeah.
End up alcoholics.
Yep.
And even though, when I first started therapy, I would explain to them about how my dad reacted with my mother, how they interacted, about the violence, about him beating her. Mm. And their first assumption always was that my dad was alcoholic. And I'm like, no, I've never seen the man touch a drink in his life.
Yeah.
They were like putting a match and oil together. They just blew up at each other. Mm. And when my mother finally had enough after 55 years of marriage and left him, and she lived the last 5 years, and both of them were probably the happiest people that I had ever seen.
Oh.
And I wonder how different our lives might have been had they gotten a divorce and they weren't married to each other, if any of this would have been any different. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that.
Yeah.
But I do know that them together made the situation worse.
A lethal combination, yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, it's that not knowing. It's hindsight can teach us a lot, can't it? It's
It sure can. It sure can. And I hope that by doing this particular program, it will help other survivors recognize that they finally have a label or something to call what happened to them. Because I think that was the hardest for me for the longest time.
Yeah.
Because everybody kept telling me that mothers don't abuse their kids. And I would think, well, if she wasn't abusing me, then what was that? Please, just somebody tell me what this was.
Yeah.
And then when I finally started counseling at the Rape and Sexual Assault Center where I live, and she was able to identify and label what had happened to me, it all made sense finally.
Yeah.
But when you have nothing to call it, no label to call it, you're constantly being told that this didn't happen to you. Something my dad would always tell me was, well, your mother loved you. She hated your sister. Well, if that was love, then
that's a funny way to show
again,
it.
that discounted my experience.
Yes. Yeah.
No, she wasn't beating me to the extent she beat my sister, but there was a lot of other abuse with the RA and all of this that we talked about today that went on that my sister didn't go through. Both of us went through abuse, just different types.
Yeah, neither way is far from love, isn't it? It's certainly not. Yeah. It's oh, Nancy. Oh, bless you. It's just whenever I speak to you, I'm my jaws sort of dropping to the floor. It's just hard to believe, isn't it, that the person that held you in the womb for 9 months can do this to their own daughters.
I think that's that's the hardest part of all this, and it's the hardest part for most of the survivors I talk to is that the mothers for us are supposed to be the ones who you can go to when you have a boo-boo and when you fall down and get scratched and you just need a hug from a hard day at school. And when that happens and you go home and you don't have that.
No.
That's the hardest part because everybody assumes that, oh, you must have misunderstood your mother. Mothers love their kids. I know she loves you deep down, Nancy. And so you're constantly being told by other people that this didn't happen. Yeah. You must have misunderstood. But I didn't misunderstand it.
No.
And mothers do abuse children, and they do sexually abuse children, and they do emotionally abuse children.
Yeah.
And it might look different than how a father does it, or a male does it, or an uncle does it, but it's still just as damaging.
Yeah, of course. Well, I would, if not more, because it's, you've got the surprise element to it as well, haven't you? The shock element. So it's sort of, abuse is abuse, but there's something, it takes it to a different level, perhaps.
It does, and that's part of what makes this so difficult, because it was so, for lack of a better word, bizarre.
Yeah.
Again, it makes it even harder to tell somebody, because you're constantly being told again that you must have misunderstood it.
Yeah.
That,
that's it.
Yeah.
Oh, Nancy, it's like this hour has gone so quickly. I could talk to you for ages. We must do another one soon about this, but it's,
I would love to. I think this is a topic that is very hard to cover in just an hour. It really is.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. No, we'll take this further in the near future. But
I really appreciate you allowing me to have this time to talk about this, and at least
not at all.
Trying to break the surface in it, and maybe we can continue it, more of it, on another show.
Let's do that. No, we must do that. It's so important, and it's like I say, it's you're great for speaking out, and good on you. I'm so proud of you, and thank you so much, Nancy, and to the audience as well for tuning in. Till next time, lots of love and God bless.